Hate is a genuinely strong word tonight. I picked it deliberately because the three things in this video genuinely do change how a finance manager treats the person sitting across the desk. None of these three things are tricks, loopholes, or anything remotely illegal. They're documented, publicly available consumer protections that simply remove leverage a dealership would otherwise quietly hold over an older buyer. And removing that leverage is exactly why a certain kind of salesperson dreads seeing them walk in the door. Here's the regulatory backdrop worth knowing first. Auto fraud complaints jumped 43% in the first quarter of 2025 compared to the year before. And this past March, the Federal Trade Commission sent formal warning letters to 97 separate dealerships over deceptive pricing and financing practices, publicly naming every single one of them by name this past May. That's not a rare, isolated problem confined to one shady lot in one unlucky town. That's a documented, agency-confirmed pattern spanning the entire country, and older buyers specifically get targeted more often, partly because dealerships have learned that a senior citizen sitting alone is statistically less likely to walk away from a bad deal once real pressure starts building in that finance office chair. One specific tactic deserves naming right now. The FTC has documented dealers advertising an approved financing rate, then quietly writing the actual contract at a meaningfully higher rate and pocketing the difference, a practice regulators call a dealer reserve markup. It's legal in most states within certain limits, but it depends entirely on the buyer never finding out there was a lower rate available in the first place. And that's precisely the kind of information gap the first thing on tonight's list closes completely before a single number gets discussed. Elder Americans specifically dominate this complaint data. Consumer protection agencies across multiple states have flagged older buyers as disproportionately represented in auto fraud complaints relative to their overall share of new vehicle purchases. A pattern serious enough that the AARP now runs a dedicated fraud helpline specifically to address exactly this documented gap in protection. Vehicle prices themselves make this genuinely urgent. Average new vehicle transaction prices now sit near $50,000. Meaning a single percentage point difference in an interest rate or a few $1,000s in unnecessary add-ons translates into real money that a fixed income buyer simply cannot afford to lose on a single afternoon. Loan terms have stretched dramatically longer recently. Nearly a quarter of all financed new vehicle purchases now carry terms of 84 months or longer, a record, and stretching a loan that far past a retirement date creates genuine financial risk that dealerships rarely mention while quoting an attractively small monthly payment figure. Negative equity compounds this problem even further. Roughly 30% of trade-ins toward new vehicles now carry negative equity, averaging nearly $7,000 owed beyond the vehicle's actual value, and that unpaid balance frequently gets quietly rolled into the next loan rather than being paid off honestly at the time of trade. Interest rates remain meaningfully elevated right now. Average auto loan rates sitting near 7% mean the difference between a credit union rate and a marked up dealership rate can easily total thousands of dollars across a full loan term, which is precisely why the first item on tonight's list matters most. Let's actually go through all three items. Each one is something you can genuinely bring with you this weekend. Each one costs nothing to obtain, and each one specifically targets a documented, real tactic dealerships have used for years against buyers who didn't come prepared with the exact right paperwork sitting in their hands. Thing one, a pre-approved financing letter. Bringing your own financing changes everything instantly. Walking in with a written pre-approval from your own bank or credit union, specifying the exact interest rate and loan amount you already qualify for, takes away the dealership's single biggest profit center before the conversation even starts. Dealers make meaningful money marking up the interest rate on financing they arrange themselves, and that markup disappears entirely the moment you're holding a competing offer already locked in on paper. Credit unions specifically deserve a mention here. Member-owned credit unions routinely offer meaningfully lower auto loan rates than dealership financing, specifically because they don't need to build a markup into the rate to generate profit the way a dealership's finance department does. Getting pre-approved usually takes less than a day, sometimes less than an hour, and it costs nothing beyond a simple credit check most banks now run without even dinging your score meaningfully. Here's exactly why dealerships genuinely dread this. A pre-approval letter forces the finance manager to either match or beat your outside rate honestly, or lose the sale to a competitor entirely. And that competition is precisely what disappears when a buyer walks in without one. Salespeople are trained to ask about financing early specifically to find out whether that competitive pressure exists. And a senior holding a printed pre-approval answers that question before it's even fully asked. Seniors face a specific vulnerability worth naming: fixed incomes, unfamiliarity with recently shifted online rate comparisons, and a documented cultural tendency toward trusting an in-person salesperson over online research all combine to make older buyers statistically more likely to accept whatever rate gets quoted across the desk. A pre-approval letter neutralizes every single one of those vulnerabilities at once because the rate is already locked before trust or unfamiliarity ever enters the conversation. The letter itself needs real specific details. A genuinely useful pre-approval includes the exact interest rate, the loan term, and the maximum amount approved, all printed clearly enough that a dealership can't claim confusion about what you're actually holding. Most banks and credit unions will provide this in writing specifically for exactly this purpose, understanding that their own customers use it as negotiating leverage at dealerships across town. Timing this letter correctly makes a difference. Rates fluctuate, so requesting pre-approval within a week or two of your actual dealership visit keeps the number accurate rather than stale, and most banks will happily refresh an approval letter with a quick phone call if your shopping timeline stretches out longer than originally planned. One more advantage rarely gets mentioned directly. Pre-approval also protects against a scam called yo-yo financing, where a dealer lets you drive away in a new vehicle before financing is actually finalized, then calls days later claiming the loan fell through and demanding a new, worse contract. Walking in with financing already locked and confirmed removes that entire scheme from the table before it can even begin against you. Dealerships can still beat your rate honestly. Nothing about a pre-approval letter forbids a dealership from offering something genuinely better. And plenty of legitimate manufacturer incentives, especially 0% promotional financing on certain models, can actually beat a credit union rate fairly, which is exactly the kind of honest competition a pre-approval letter is designed to encourage rather than prevent. Credit scores matter enormously in this conversation. Knowing your own score before walking in prevents a finance manager from claiming your credit is worse than it actually is, a documented tactic used to justify a higher rate than a buyer genuinely qualifies for, and free credit reports are available annually from all three major bureaus without any cost whatsoever. Shopping multiple lenders costs almost nothing extra. Credit scoring models treat multiple auto loan inquiries within a short window, typically 14 to 45 days depending on the model, as a single inquiry rather than several, meaning a buyer can genuinely compare 3 or 4 lenders without meaningfully damaging their own credit score in the process. Loan term length deserves careful thought too. A pre-approval for 60 months rather than 84 keeps total interest dramatically lower even at the exact same rate, and locking that shorter term in advance removes the temptation to stretch the loan later just to make a slightly more expensive vehicle fit the monthly budget. Down payment size shapes everything downstream too. Arriving with a meaningful down payment already set aside, ideally 20% on a new vehicle, protects against the negative equity trap that leaves so many buyers owing more than their vehicle is worth, especially in the first 3 years when depreciation moves fastest. Thing 2. A written out the door price. Quote monthly payments genuinely hide the real number. Dealerships have long understood that most buyers focus almost entirely on the monthly payment figure rather than the total amount actually being financed, and stretching a loan term quietly shrinks that monthly number while growing the total interest paid over the life of the loan. Bringing a written demand for the full out the door price forces the conversation back to the number that actually matters most. The FTC has specifically documented this tactic. Warning letters sent to dealerships this year cited advertised prices that failed to reflect mandatory fees, meaning the number pulling a buyer through the front door was never actually the number they'd end up paying at the signing table. A written request for the complete out-the-door price, including every single fee, closes that gap before a single form gets signed. Print this specific request before leaving home. A simple written line stating you require the total out-the-door price, covering the vehicle, all fees, taxes, and any add-ons, before discussing any monthly payment whatsoever, changes the entire negotiating dynamic the moment you hand it across the desk. It signals immediately that you already understand how the math typically gets obscured. Add-on products deserve their own mention. Extended warranties, paint protection packages, and gap insurance routinely get bundled into a contract with inflated markups, sometimes without a buyer ever realizing they agreed to purchase them at all. A written price request that explicitly excludes anything beyond the vehicle itself, unless you specifically approve each add-on by name, closes that particular loophole completely before it opens. Seniors get targeted with add-ons often. Extended warranty products marketed around long-term reliability concerns tend to resonate more with older buyers already thinking carefully about a vehicle's remaining useful years, and that resonance gets exploited by finance managers trained to frame every single add-on as protecting a fixed income from surprise expenses down the road. Requesting this document in writing matters enormously. A verbal promise about the out-the-door price can quietly shift by the time paperwork actually reaches the signing table. But a written request, held in your own hand and referenced directly during the conversation, creates a paper trail a dealership has to actively contradict rather than simply forget about later. This single document also speeds up shopping. Requesting the identical out-the-door price format from multiple dealerships lets you compare apples to apples rather than getting lost in different monthly payment structures across different lots, each one designed independently to look attractive without actually being comparable to the next. The FTC's own CARS rule targeted this. Before it was vacated on procedural grounds, the rule would have required dealers nationwide to disclose the true offering price up front and prohibited charging for add-ons that provide no genuine benefit. Protections an estimated $3.4 billion a year would have saved consumers according to the agency's own published estimate. Documentation fees vary wildly across different states. Some states cap this specific fee by law at under $100, while others allow dealerships to charge many hundreds for essentially the same paperwork, and knowing your own state's cap before walking in prevents a completely avoidable overcharge on a line item most buyers never think to question. Trade-in values deserve a separate negotiation. Dealerships frequently blend a trade-in value into the new vehicle price, quietly offsetting a generous-sounding trade offer against a less generous vehicle price, and insisting on negotiating both numbers completely separately prevents that particular shell game before it can start. Written quotes travel between dealerships remarkably well. Emailing an out-the-door request to several dealerships in your region before ever visiting one in person often produces genuinely competitive offers without any showroom pressure at all, and those written responses become powerful leverage when you finally do walk through a door. Rebates and incentives complicate the picture further. Manufacturer rebates for military service, recent college graduation, or loyalty to a specific brand can meaningfully lower the price, but they're frequently applied inconsistently, which makes a written breakdown showing exactly which incentives were included genuinely essential before agreeing to anything. Taxes and registration should appear separately, too. A truly complete out-the-door quote itemizes sales tax, title, registration, and documentation fees as distinct lines rather than lumping them into one vague total, since that separation makes it immediately obvious if any single line has been quietly inflated beyond what your state actually requires. Dealer-installed accessories frequently appear without warning. Pinstriping, nitrogen-filled tires, fabric protection, and window etching routinely show up on a final invoice as pre-installed items, and the FTC has specifically cited dealerships charging for exactly these kinds of add-ons without obtaining genuine consent from the buyer first. Gap insurance deserves particular scrutiny before purchasing. This product covers the difference between what you owe and what a vehicle is worth after a total loss, genuinely useful in some situations, But dealership markups on gap coverage routinely run far above what the same protection costs through your own auto insurance company instead. Extended warranties can be purchased later too. Nothing requires buying a service contract on the same day you buy the vehicle and shopping that coverage separately. After the pressure of the showroom has passed entirely, routinely produces meaningfully better pricing on identical protection from the exact same underwriter. Compare the total cost, not the payment. Two identical vehicles at the exact same monthly payment can differ by thousands of dollars in total cost depending entirely on the loan term underneath, which is precisely why an out-the-door price request sidesteps the single most misleading number in the entire transaction. 4 square worksheets deserve genuine caution too. This classic dealership tool splits a negotiation into trade value, price, down payment, and monthly payment, letting a salesperson shift numbers between boxes. So a concession in one area quietly gets recovered in another without a buyer ever noticing the offset. Ask for the actual buyer's order specifically. This single document lists the actual agreed price, and every fee before financing gets layered on top, and requesting it early forces clarity at exactly the moment most buyers are still being steered toward, talking about monthly payments instead. Spot delivery risks deserve one final mention. Driving a vehicle home before financing is fully finalized creates the exact vulnerability yo-yo financing depends on, and simply waiting until every signature is complete and the loan is genuinely funded removes that risk entirely at the cost of nothing more than a small amount of patience. Thing 3. A second person in the room. Isolation is genuinely the oldest sales tactic. High-pressure sales environments work best on a buyer facing that pressure entirely alone, without anyone else in the room to notice when a promise quietly shifts or a tactic starts feeling uncomfortable. Bringing a trusted companion, an adult child, a friend, or even a paid advocate removes that isolation completely and changes the entire tone of the conversation almost immediately. AARP specifically recommends this exact practice too. The organization's own consumer protection guidance encourages older shoppers to bring a second person along to any major purchase negotiation precisely because a witness changes how aggressively a salesperson is willing to push, and because a second set of ears catches details a stressed or rushed buyer might otherwise miss entirely. Salespeople genuinely behave differently with witnesses present. Training materials across the auto sales industry emphasize building rapport and trust with a solo buyer, specifically because that rapport is harder to manufacture convincingly once a second, more skeptical person joins the conversation and starts asking their own independent questions the salesperson didn't anticipate. This companion doesn't need special expertise either. Simply having someone present who can say, "Wait, let's step outside and talk about this for a minute," breaks the momentum a skilled salesperson relies on to close a deal before second thoughts can fully form. That momentum, the sense that today is the only day this price exists, depends entirely on keeping a buyer moving forward without a natural pause. Elder financial abuse is a documented problem. State attorneys general and the AARP Fraud Watch Network both track patterns where isolated seniors get pressured into unfavorable financial decisions specifically because nobody else was present to intervene. And major purchases like a vehicle sit squarely inside the category of decisions where a trusted witness provides genuine practical protection. If a companion isn't available, alternatives exist. Calling a trusted family member on speakerphone during key moments, or simply telling the salesperson directly that no decision gets made without a family member reviewing the paperwork first, accomplishes much of the same protective effect even without a physical second person standing in the room. The AARP Fraud Watch helpline exists specifically. Reachable at 877-908-3360, this free resource lets any buyer, senior, or otherwise get real-time guidance before signing anything that feels rushed or confusing. Another layer of protection that costs nothing and takes only a phone call. 4 eyes catch far more than 2. A companion reading the contract alongside you naturally spots discrepancies between what was verbally promised and what the paperwork actually says, and those discrepancies are exactly where the most expensive surprises tend to hide, buried in a stack of documents nobody expects a buyer to fully read carefully. Scheduling the visit thoughtfully helps enormously too. Bringing a companion works best when neither of you is rushed, tired, or squeezed between other obligations, since fatigue is precisely the condition high-pressure sales tactics are designed to exploit, and a well-rested pair of buyers makes dramatically better decisions than one exhausted person alone. Never sign anything the same day necessarily. Telling a salesperson up front that you're gathering information today and deciding later removes the artificial urgency almost every closing technique depends on, and any dealership genuinely unwilling to honor a price 24 hours later is telling you something important about that specific offer. Bring reading glasses and take your time. Contracts get printed in genuinely small type, and a finance manager sliding a stack of documents across a desk while talking continuously is counting on a buyer skimming rather than reading, which is exactly why slowing down and reading every single line matters more than almost anything else. Ask for a copy of everything signed. Walking out with duplicates of every document you put your name on, rather than a promise that copies will be mailed later, protects against any discrepancy between what you actually agreed to and what a dealership later claims was in the paperwork. Recording laws vary meaningfully by individual state. In many states, a buyer may legally record a conversation they're personally part of, which creates an additional record of verbal promises, though checking your own state's specific consent requirements first is genuinely important before recording anything inside a dealership office. Bringing a mechanic helps with used purchases. A pre-purchase inspection from an independent mechanic, typically costing around $150, routinely uncovers problems a dealership either missed or chose not to disclose. And any seller refusing to allow that inspection has effectively answered your most important question already. Family members should understand the plan beforehand. Discussing your budget, your maximum price, and your walkaway point with your companion before arriving prevents any confusion inside the dealership itself. And it means both of you are genuinely aligned rather than negotiating separately in front of a salesperson watching for exactly that kind of gap. Power of attorney arrangements deserve careful thought. For seniors managing significant health challenges, having a trusted family member with legal authority to review or halt a major purchase provides real protection, though setting that arrangement up properly requires an attorney rather than a handshake agreement with a relative. The honest takeaway. Now I have to complicate this video. Most dealerships and most salespeople are genuinely honest professionals doing an honest job, and treating every single dealership visit as an adversarial ambush isn't a fair or accurate picture of the actual industry as a whole. The documented bad actors are real and worth protecting against, but they don't represent the majority of the thousands of dealerships operating across this country today. These three things help any buyer too. Nothing about a pre-approval letter, a written price request, or a trusted companion is specifically limited to seniors, and any buyer of any age walking into a negotiation prepared with all three genuinely improves their own outcome regardless of their birth year or how much car buying experience they already carry with them. It's also worth naming the uncertainty honestly. The FTC's CARS rule, specifically designed to ban many of the tactics discussed tonight, was finalized in 2024 and then vacated by a federal appeals court in January 2025 on procedural grounds rather than on the actual merits of consumer protection. That leaves a genuine gap where some protections exist only through diligence rather than through enforced federal law right now. State-level protections are filling that gap. California's own CARS Act takes effect this October, specifically prohibiting many of the same deceptive practices the federal rule once targeted. And other states are actively watching that rollout to decide whether similar legislation makes sense in their own legislatures over the coming year. Federal laws still protect buyers meaningfully today. The Truth in Lending Act requires clear disclosure of financing terms. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act prohibits discriminatory lending, and every single state maintains its own unfair and deceptive practices statutes, meaning a buyer who gets genuinely misled still has real legal recourse even without the vacated cars rule. Documentation protects you long after signing too. Keeping every advertisement, every written quote, and every email exchange creates the exact paper trail a state attorney general or a consumer attorney needs if something later turns out genuinely different from what was promised at the dealership on the day of purchase. State attorney general complaints carry real weight. Consumer protection divisions in most states actively investigate patterns of dealership misconduct. And a single well-documented complaint occasionally triggers a broader investigation that helps hundreds of other buyers who never even knew they'd been overcharged in the exact same way. None of this requires automatic suspicion everywhere. It means walking in prepared the same way you'd prepare for any major financial decision involving tens of thousands of dollars, treating these three things as basic due diligence rather than confrontation, and recognizing that a dealership that genuinely welcomes a prepared, informed buyer is telling you something valuable about how they actually do business. Good dealerships genuinely appreciate an informed buyer. A prepared customer who already understands financing, pricing, and add-ons moves through a transaction faster and complains less afterward, which is exactly why plenty of honest salespeople quietly prefer working with someone holding a pre-approval letter over someone who needs everything explained from scratch. Online reviews genuinely help identify better dealerships. Reading recent reviews specifically mentioning the finance office experience rather than just the sales floor reveals far more about how a specific dealership actually handles the part of the transaction where most complaints originate in the first place. Manufacturer-certified programs add another protective layer. Buying through a certified pre-owned program means a manufacturer, not just a dealership, has inspected the vehicle and backs it with extended warranty coverage, which shifts some accountability away from the individual lot and toward a much larger company with a reputation to protect. Walking away remains your single strongest tool. No pre-approval letter, written quote, or trusted companion matters as much as a genuine willingness to leave a dealership empty-handed, because every single negotiating tactic on both sides of the desk ultimately depends on which party believes the other one cannot walk out that door. Timing your purchase strategically genuinely saves money. End of month, end of quarter, and end of model year all create real pressure on dealerships to move inventory and hit sales targets, which means an identical vehicle can carry a meaningfully different price depending entirely on which week you happen to walk in. Online car buying platforms changed this landscape. Services offering no haggle pricing and home delivery genuinely remove much of the in-person pressure discussed throughout tonight's video, though they carry their own trade-offs around inspection quality and return policies that deserve equally careful reading before committing. None of these three things guarantee anything. A prepared buyer can still end up with a vehicle that develops problems, a rate that looks worse in hindsight, or a purchase they simply regret later, because preparation reduces risk rather than eliminating it entirely from a transaction this large and this complicated. Complaints genuinely do change actual dealership behavior. The 97 dealerships publicly named by the FTC this year got there because real buyers filed real complaints. And every single complaint filed with a state attorney general or the FTC builds the documented pattern that eventually triggers enforcement action protecting everyone else. Sharing this information matters more than watching. If you know a senior in your own family currently shopping for a vehicle, forwarding these three specific items to them costs nothing and takes 30 seconds, and it might genuinely save them thousands of dollars on a purchase happening this very weekend. The real goal here was never distrust. It's walking in as an equal participant in the negotiation rather than the only person in the room who doesn't already know how the math actually works, because that specific imbalance, more than any single tactic, is what these three things were always designed to correct from the very beginning. Every buyer deserves to understand exactly what they're signing, exactly what it costs in total rather than monthly, and exactly what happens if something goes wrong afterward. A pre-approval letter, a written out the door quote, and a trusted second person in the room accomplish all three of those goals at once, cost essentially nothing to arrange, and require no special expertise, no legal training, and no confrontation whatsoever. Bring all three the next time you shop, or hand this list to someone in your life who's about to, because the entire point of knowing how something works is making sure the people you care about walk in already knowing it too.